The rawhide fell like a tongue of fire, licking across Ilara's bared back, each strike a fresh searing agony that stole her breath and threatened to shatter the fragile wall of her composure. Dust, acrid and gritty, filled her nostrils, a choking counterpoint to the iron tang of blood in her mouth where she'd bitten her lip through. Around her, the silence of the assembled townsfolk was a heavier weight than their judgment, a thick, expectant hush broken only by the whistling descent of the lash and the grunts of Marshal Thorne, the man designated to deliver this public penance. Her crime: refusal. Refusal to bind her life to Jedediah Croft, a man whose touch felt like frost and whose eyes held the predatory gleam of a coyote sizing up a tethered lamb. Croft himself stood near the makeshift platform, his arms crossed, a smug satisfaction barely concealed beneath a veneer of righteous propriety. He owned half the town of Redemption, or so it was said, and what he didn't own, he coveted. Ilara, apparently, was now part of that inventory. Her worn cotton shift, torn from her shoulders, offered no protection, no dignity. Each blow was meant to break not just her skin, but her will, to carve submission into her very soul. Her vision blurred, the faces in the crowd swimming in a haze of pain and shimmering heat. She heard a woman sob, quickly stifled. She heard a nervous cough. But mostly, she heard the silence, the vast, damning silence of complicity. Her own voice was a trap bird in her chest, fluttering wildly, unable to escape. She had spoken her truth, her refusal, clearly and calmly in the elders' council, and this was her reward. The sun beat down, merciless. Another blow, and a gasp tore from her, involuntary. She tasted blood again, saltier this time. This was not justice, it was possession, brutal and ugly. She closed her eyes, trying to find some distant, untouched core within herself, a place the lash could not reach. The world narrowed to the next impact, the next wave of fire. Then, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. The lash, poised for another descent, did not fall. Thorne's grunt of effort was cut short. Ilara, sagging against the rough-hewn post, her wrists bound above her, dared to crack an eyelid. Silence. But this silence was different. It was charged, taut, like the air before a lightning strike. Thorne stood frozen, the whip dangling from his hand, his florid face now pale. Croft's smugness had vanished, replaced by a confused outrage. The crowd murmured, a low, uneasy sound, like wind through dry leaves. Into the cleared space before the post stepped a figure. Tall, lean, with the kind of stillness that spoke of coiled power rather than passivity. His skin was the color of rich earth, his black hair drawn back from a face that seemed carved from ancient stone, impassive yet intensely aware. He wore no adornment of the town, no trappings of their harsh god or harsher laws. His attire was simple, practical, buckskin leggings, a loose tunic. A Modoc warrior, Ilara's pain-fogged mind registered, though what one would be doing this far into settled territory, and why he would interfere, was beyond her comprehension. He moved with a fluid grace that made the townsfolk seem clumsy and rooted. He did not speak. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over Ilara's ravaged back, then lifted to meet Thorne's gaze. Thorne, a man known for his bluster and brutality, visibly recoiled, taking an involuntary step back. The warrior's gaze then shifted to Jedediah Croft. Croft puffed himself up, opening his mouth to speak, a vein throbbing in his temple. "This is not your concern," Injun, the word died on his lips. The warrior had not moved, had not threatened, yet the air around him crackled with an unspoken warning that even Croft, in his arrogance, could not ignore. The warrior turned his back on Croft, a dismissal more profound than any curse. He approached Ilara. She flinched, expecting more pain, another form of degradation. Instead, he produced a knife, its blade gleaming dully in the oppressive sunlight. With two swift, precise movements, he severed the ropes binding her wrists. Ilara crumpled, her legs giving way, but before she could hit the dusty ground, he was there, catching her with an arm that was surprisingly gentle for all its strength. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, her torn shift barely clinging to her. Her head lolled against his shoulder, the scent of pine needles, leather, and something wild and clean filled her senses, a stark contrast to the stench of sweat, fear, and dust that had enveloped her. He began to walk, straight through the stunned crowd. They parted before him like water before a prow, their faces a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and a dawning, reluctant respect. No one spoke. No one moved to stop him. Jedediah Croft's face was a mask of impotent fury, but even he remained silent, watching the Modoc warrior carry Elara away from redemption, away from the life that had sought to break her. The only sounds were the warrior's steady footfalls on the dry earth and Elara's ragged, shallow breaths as consciousness began to abandon her to the encroaching darkness. Her last thought before the blackness claimed her completely was of the silence, not the damning silence of the crowd, but the profound, protective silence of the man who carried her. It was a silence that felt, impossibly, like a shield. The journey was a blur of pain, thirst, and fragmented images. Sometimes Elara felt the sway of the warrior's stride, the hard planes of his body against hers. Other times, she was adrift in a fever dream, the sun a malevolent eye, the shadows of trees like grasping claws. She remembered water, cool and sweet, trickling past her cracked lips, a sensation so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She remembered the warrior's hands, surprisingly gentle, cleaning her wounds with damp moss, the sting of some unknown poultice that nevertheless seemed to draw out the fire. He never spoke. Not once. His silence was a constant, an unwavering presence in the shifting landscape of her suffering. They traveled for what felt like days, though Elara had no true sense of time. The terrain changed from the harsh, open scrubland surrounding Redemption to denser forests, cooler and smelling of damp earth and pine. Finally, he laid her down on a bed of soft furs in a place sheltered by an overhang of rock, a shallow cave that offered protection from the elements. A small, smokeless fire provided a flickering light and a surprising warmth. For days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was lucid, she would see him, sometimes sitting by the fire, his gaze distant, sometimes returning with fresh water or herbs. He moved with an economy of motion, every action purposeful. He would check her wounds, reapply the poultices, and offer her sips of a thin, nourishing broth. His touch was impersonal, yet careful. She was a creature he had rescued, a responsibility he had undertaken. Fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was a different fear now. Not the terror of Croft's cruelty or the town's judgment, but the primal fear of the unknown, of her own vulnerability in the hands of this silent, enigmatic stranger. Yet, his silence was also a strange comfort. It demanded nothing of her. There were no questions to answer, no justifications to make. In his presence, she was simply allowed to be, to heal. Her back throbbed, a constant reminder of her ordeal, but the intense, burning agony began to subside, replaced by a deep, aching soreness. The fever broke, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She started to observe him more closely. His face, in repose, held a profound sadness, a weariness that seemed etched into the lines around his eyes. His eyes themselves were like deep pools, reflecting the firelight, revealing nothing of his thoughts. He ate little, mostly a type of dried meat and some foraged roots. He always ensured she had broth or the tenderest parts of whatever he managed to hunt, a rabbit, the bird. One morning, she woke to find him gone. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. Had he abandoned her? Was she now alone in this wilderness? She tried to sit up, a cry of despair caught in her throat, but the movement sent daggers of pain through her back, and she fell back, gasping. Then she saw it, a small stack of firewood beside the cold ashes of the fire, a water skin filled to bursting, and a piece of cooked meat wrapped in leaves. He had not abandoned her. He had provided for her. The relief was so overwhelming it left her trembling. He returned as dusk was settling, carrying a brace of grouse. He nodded once in her direction, a minimal acknowledgement, then set about preparing the birds. Elara watched him, a new emotion stirring within her, tentative and fragile, trust. It was a seedling pushing through scorched earth, but it was there. That night, she spoke for the first time since redemption. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, rusty from disuse. Thank you. He paused in his work, his dark eyes meeting hers across the small fire. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave another slight nod before returning to his task. no words, but in his eyes she thought she saw a flicker of something, understanding, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the firelight. The silence between them resettled, but it felt different now, less a void and more a shared space. The healing was slow, agonizingly so. The deep furrows in her back began to close, knitting together into angry red welts that promised to become permanent scars. She learned to move carefully, to conserve her strength. Cale, she had decided to call him Cale in her mind, for he had offered no name and she needed one to anchor him, continued his silent ministrations. He would sometimes bring her plants, crushing a leaf for her to smell, or pointing out a particular berry, then eating one himself to show it was safe. She was learning, absorbing his knowledge through observation. He was teaching her to read the language of the wilderness, a language written in bent twigs, animal tracks, and the subtle shift of the wind. Her own internal landscape was slowly changing too. The raw wound of her humiliation in redemption began to scar over, not disappearing, but becoming a part of her, a testament to what she had endured. Beneath the pain and the fear, a new feeling was taking root, a cold, hard anger. Not the fiery rage that consumed, but a deep, unyielding resolve. Jedediah Croft had tried to own her, to break her. The town had watched, complicit in their silence. She would not be broken. She would not be owned. This quiet warrior, with his profound silence, had shown her that another way was possible. He had demanded nothing, taken nothing, only given safety, care, a space to heal. One day, Cale brought her a smooth, slender branch and his knife. He laid them before her, then resumed his task of sharpening an arrowhead. Elara looked at the wood, then at the knife. An offering? A test? She picked up the branch. It felt cool and solid in her hand. She picked up the knife. It was heavy, perfectly balanced. Hesitantly, she began to shave off slivers of bark, imitating the way she had seen him work wood. It was clumsy at first, but there was a satisfaction in the simple act, in creating something, however small. Cale didn't look up, but she felt his awareness. The silence in their small shelter was no longer empty, it was filled with the sound of her knife against wood, a quiet rhythm of nascent purpose. Weeks bled into a month, then another. The scars on Elara's back tightened, pulling at her skin, a constant reminder, yet the raw agony had faded to a dull ache, then to a memory that lived more in her mind than in her flesh. She grew stronger, her limbs, once weak and trembling, now moved with a new sureness. Cale had, without a single word of instruction, become her teacher. He would leave a bow and a quiver of arrows near her sleeping furs, or a fishing line plaited from sinew. He never forced, never pushed. He simply provided the tools, and by his own example, demonstrated their use. She watched him move through the forest with the silence of a shadow, his senses alive to every whisper of the wind, every rustle in the undergrowth. She began to emulate him, learning to quiet her own movements, to listen with more than just her ears, to see with more than just her eyes. Her first attempts were clumsy. She startled game, tripped over roots, her frustration a bitter taste in her mouth. Cale never commented, never corrected directly. But sometimes, after a particularly inept attempt on her part to track a deer, she would find he had left a clear set of prints for her to follow, or subtly guided her gaze to a sign she had missed. It was a pedagogy of patience, of showing, not telling. Her hands, once soft from town life, became calloused and capable. She learned to set snares that actually caught something, to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones, to start a fire with a hand drill, though Cale's flint and steel were far more efficient. He showed her how to tan a hide, the repetitive, physically demanding work strengthening her arms and her resolve. The silence between them remained, yet it was now a comfortable, understood thing. Words seemed superfluous, almost an intrusion. A shared glance, a nod, the slight inclination of his head, these were their currency of communication. Sometimes, in the evenings, as the fire crackled and threw dancing shadows on the cave walls, she would work on the piece of wood he had given her. It was slowly taking shape under her hesitant carving, though what it would become, she didn't yet know. It was enough that her hands were busy, her mind focused. She began to feel a sense of self emerging that was entirely new. The Elara of redemption, the woman who had been publicly shamed and broken, felt like a distant ancestor. This new Elara was quieter, more watchful, her body leaner, harder, her spirit tempered in the crucible of pain and forged anew in the solitude of the wilderness. The fear was still there, a cold ember deep inside, but now it was overlaid with a layer of resilience, a knowledge of her own capacity to endure, to adapt, to survive. One day, Cale returned from a hunt with a stern set to his jaw, his usual impassivity disturbed by a subtle tension. He laid down a young buck, his movements economical as always, but his eye scanned the tree line with an intensity that made Elara's heart quicken. Later, as they ate, he pushed a small, finely crafted knife towards her, not his own utility knife, but a smaller, sleeker blade, its handle wrapped in worn leather. It was clearly old, but perfectly maintained. Elara looked at him, questioning. He met her gaze, then tapped his own chest, then hers, then pointed towards the forest. The message was clear: protection. For you. From what is out there. A shiver traced its way down her spine, not entirely from fear, but from the gravity of his gesture. This was more than a tool, it was a transference of trust, of responsibility. She picked it up, the cool metal a serious weight in her palm. She closed her fingers around the leather-bound hilt. It felt like an extension of her own hand. That night, sleep eluded her. The sounds of the forest, usually a comforting blanket, seemed sharper, filled with hidden meanings. Cale sat by the fire, unmoving, a sentinel. He had taught her to survive. Now, it seemed, he was preparing her to fight. The memory of Jedediah Croft's face, contorted with rage as she was carried away, flashed in her mind. He was not a man to easily forget a slight, or to relinquish what he considered his property. The world outside their sanctuary was still out there, and sooner or later, it would find them. Or she would have to find it. The thought no longer filled her with pure terror. Instead, a grim determination settled over her. She was not the same woman. The scars on her back were a map of her journey, and the knife in her hand was a promise to herself. She would not be a victim again. The change in Cale was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet Elara felt it in the increased vigilance in his gaze, the way he now circled their camp wider and more frequently before settling for the night. He began to push her harder in her training, though still without words. He would initiate sparring sessions, armed with blunt sticks, his movements swift and unpredictable, forcing her to react, to defend, to find openings. Her body ached from the exertion, new bruises blooming alongside the fading ones, but with each session, her reflexes sharpened, her understanding of leverage and balance deepened. He taught her to use the knife he had given her not just for utility, but as a weapon, its edge a deadly whisper. He showed her how to throw it with accuracy, how to wield it in close quarters, his touch brief and instructive as he adjusted her grip, her stance. There was no anger in his training, no brutality, only a focused intensity, a desire to impart skill, to arm her against a threat he clearly anticipated. Her internal monologue became a constant assessment of her surroundings, her own capabilities. The Elara who had flinched at shadows was being replaced by a woman who studied them, who understood that they could offer concealment as well as harbor danger. The fear of Croft, of redemption, hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing specter but a whetstone against which she sharpened her resolve. She thought of the townsfolk, their silent judgment. Had any of them ever known true freedom, or were they all, in their own ways, bound by unseen ropes? One crisp morning, Cale returned from a scouting foray with a troubled look that was unmistakable even on his stoic features. He carried something in his hand, a tattered piece of calico, the pattern sickeningly familiar. Elara's breath caught in her throat. It was from a dress she had owned in redemption, a dress she had worn often. She looked at Cale, her eyes wide with unspoken questions. He merely laid the fabric scrap on a rock, his gaze holding hers. They were being hunted. Actively. Jedediah Croft's tendrils were reaching even into this remote wilderness. A cold dread washed over Elara, followed by a surge of defiant anger. She would not run forever. She would not live her life looking over her shoulder. That evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold across the western sky, Elara sat by the fire, the small knife Cale had given her resting in her lap. She ran a thumb over the smooth, worn leather of its hilt. She had been given a name by her parents, a name that had been sullied and shamed in redemption. Elara. It meant light, or star. For a long time, she had felt anything but. Now, a new understanding of it began to dawn. A star was distant, self-contained, burning with its own fire. Perhaps she could reclaim that meaning. She looked at Cale, who was watching the flames, his profile stern and unreadable. Cale, she said, her voice clear and steady, the first time she had spoken his chosen name aloud to him. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes fixing on hers. There was no surprise in them, only a quiet attentiveness. They will not stop, she continued, the words coming more easily now, as if a dam had broken. Croft. He will not stop until he believes he has reasserted his claim. Cale's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker deep within his eyes, an affirmation of her words. I will not be hunted like an animal, Elara stated, her voice gaining strength. I will not live in fear. My name is Elara. And I am not his property. She picked up the knife. You have taught me much. You have given me back my strength. More than that, you have shown me a different way to be. A faint smile touched Cale's lips, a fleeting expression so rare it was like sighting a comet. It vanished as quickly as it came, but it warmed Elara from the inside out. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Then he rose and retrieved his bow and quiver, and the longer, heavier knife he himself carried. He checked the tension of the bowstring, selected a few arrows, his movements economical and precise. He then looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. Are you ready? Elara stood, her own knife now securely tucked into the disc-in belt she wore. She met his gaze, her own clear and resolute. I am ready, she said. Not to run. Not necessarily to seek out a fight. But ready to face whatever came, on her own terms. The stars were fiercely bright that night, scattered like diamonds on black velvet. Elara looked up at them, truly seeing them for the first time, and felt a kinship. She was Elara. And she would find her own light, even in the deepest darkness. The confrontation, when it came, was not in the deep wilderness Cale had chosen for their sanctuary, but closer to the edges of what men called civilization. It was as if an invisible thread had pulled Elara back towards the source of her torment, not for revenge, but for resolution. Cale had sensed the shift in her, the hardening of her purpose. He did not question it, merely adapted, his vigilance a silent cloak around her. They had been tracking a small group of riders for 2 days, men whose clumsy passage through the forest floor spoke of town-bred arrogance rather than true woodcraft. Jedediah Croft was among them, his voice, when it carried on the wind, grating and imperious. Cale had identified a narrow pass, a place where the hunters could become the hunted, or at least, where any engagement would be on terms more favorable to 2 against 5. Elara felt a tremor of the old fear, the remembered sting of the lash, the crushing weight of public humiliation. But beneath it, her newfound strength held firm, a bedrock of resolve. She touched the hilt of her knife, the worn leather a familiar comfort. Cale moved like a phantom, positioning himself on a rocky outcrop overlooking the pass, his bowstring already marked with an arrow. He gave Elara a single, brief glance, a look that conveyed trust, readiness, and a grim acceptance of what was to come. He would be her shadow, her support, but this was her stand to make. The riders entered the pass, Croft in the lead, his face flushed with exertion and impatience. His men fanned out slightly, their eyes scanning the trees with a mixture of unease and overconfidence. She can't have gone far, Croft declared, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. The savage who took her will tire of her eventually. And then she'll learn the price of defiance. Elara stepped out from behind a thicket of mountain laurel, positioning herself in the center of the narrow trail. She held no weapon openly, her hands at her sides, but her stance was poised, her gaze direct and unwavering as she met Croft's astonished eyes. Silence descended, thick and sudden. The riders reined in their horses, confusion warring with hostility on their faces. Croft's jaw dropped, his eyes widening in disbelief, then narrowing into slits of fury. Well, well, he sneered, recovering quickly. The stray lamb returns to the fold. Or did your dark-skinned protector finally abandon you, girl? Ilara's voice, when she spoke, was calm, clear, carrying easily in the still air. My name is Ilara, Jedediah. And I am no one's lamb. I am not yours. Croft's face purpled. You insolent. He gestured to his men. Take her. And find that Modoc. I'll see him hang for interfering with town justice. Two of his men dismounted, drawing pistols, their expressions ugly. Ilara did not move. I will not go with you, she said, her voice quiet but resonant with an unshakable certainty. You have no claim on me. Your laws, your town, your desires, they mean nothing to me here. As the men advanced, an arrow hissed from the rocks above, embedding itself in the dirt mere inches from the leading man's boot. He yelped, jumping back, his eyes darting upwards in terror. Croft roared, he's here. Find him. Kill him. But his men hesitated, their bravado deserting them as they stared into the silent, unyielding forest that suddenly seemed alive with unseen threats. Cale remained invisible, a silent promise of deadly intervention if needed. Ilara drew her knife, the blade catching the dappled sunlight. It was not a grand gesture, but a simple statement of intent. I will not be taken, she repeated. One of the dismounted men, bolder or stupider than his companion, lunged at her. Ilara moved with a speed and precision that would have been unthinkable months before. She sidestepped his clumsy rush, her knife a silver flash. He cried out, stumbling back, clutching his arm where a crimson line now bloomed on his sleeve. He hadn't been gravely wounded, but the shock of her effective defense, her transformation from victim to combatant, was palpable. Croft, seeing his authority and his assumptions crumble, drew his own pistol, his face a mask of frustrated rage. You damn! Before he could aim, before he could fire, Cale acted. Not with an arrow to kill, but with one that struck the pistol from Croft's hand, sending it spinning into the undergrowth. Another arrow pinned the sleeve of Croft's remaining mounted man to the trunk of a nearby pine, eliciting a howl of pain and surprise. The fight, such as it was, drained out of them. They were outmaneuvered, outwitted, their bluster deflated by silent skill and unwavering resolve. Croft stared at Ilara, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and a new, dawning fear. She was not the broken creature he had sought to possess. She was something else entirely, something he did not understand and could no longer control. This isn't over, he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Ilara met his gaze, her own steady. For me, Jedediah, she said softly, it is. Go back to redemption. Tell them Ilara sends her regards. Tell them she found her own justice, and her own peace. She sheathed her knife. Cale remained unseen, his presence a powerful, silent deterrent. Slowly, his face a contortion of fury and humiliation, Croft remounted his horse. His remaining men, cowed and unnerved, scrambled to retrieve their injured companion and the one pinned by the arrow. Without another word, they turned and rode away, their retreat far less orderly than their arrival. Ilara watched them go, the tension slowly ebbing from her shoulders. When they were out of sight, Cale emerged from the rocks, his bow unstrung, his expression unreadable as ever, yet she felt a sense of quiet approval radiating from him. He looked at her, then at the path where Croft had disappeared, then back at her. A single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. She had faced her past, not with hatred, but with the strength she had forged in the wilderness, with the quiet dignity he had helped her reclaim. The silence that settled around them now was truly peaceful, the silence of a battle won, not through overwhelming force, but through courage and the quiet assertion of self. The dust settled on the trail, and with it, a profound stillness settled in Ilara's soul. Croft and his men were gone, their threats diminishing with every hoofbeat carrying them back towards the oppressive confines of redemption. She looked at Cale, his silhouette stark against the afternoon sky. He had been her shield, her teacher, her silent guardian, but he had allowed her to fight her own battle, to reclaim her own voice. The debt she owed him was immeasurable, yet he would never ask for payment. That was his way. They did not speak of the encounter. Words were unnecessary. The shared experience, the quiet victory, resonated between them, strengthening the unspoken bond. For several more weeks, they journeyed, moving deeper into the wilder, more untamed lands that Cale called home. The urgency was gone, replaced by a sense of deliberate wandering. Ilara continued to learn, to absorb the rhythms of the natural world, her senses sharpening, her spirit finding a solace she had never known. The land itself was a balm, its ancient wisdom seeping into her bones. She learned the names of the stars as Cale knew them, the stories they told. She learned the properties of plants not just for survival, but for healing, for ritual. Her hands, once soft, then calloused, now moved with a practiced grace, whether she was dressing a hide, carving a piece of wood, or simply tracing the patterns in the bark of a tree. The small piece of wood Cale had given her so long ago had finally taken shape. It was a bird, a hawk, its wings slightly spread, its head tilted as if listening to some distant call. It was not a perfect carving, but it was hers, imbued with her journey, her pain, her resilience. One evening, as they sat by a clear, rushing stream, the air cool and fragrant with pine, Cale surprised her. He spoke. His voice, rarely used for more than a single word or sound, was low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "The hawk seeks its own sky," he said, looking not at her, but at the carving she held in her hands. Ilara looked up, startled. It was the longest sentence she had ever heard him utter. His dark eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not sadness, but a profound understanding. "You have learned to fly," he continued, his gaze gentle. "Your wings are strong now." Ilara felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and an unexpected sorrow. She understood. Their paths, which had run parallel for a season, were about to diverge. He had brought her to safety, had equipped her for survival, had witnessed her reclamation of self. His quiet duty was fulfilled. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice soft. He gestured vaguely towards the distant, snow-capped mountains that loomed on the horizon. "My people," he said simply. The seasons turned. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "And I?" He looked at her then, a long, searching gaze. "Your sky, Ilara. You will find it. Or make it." He reached into a small pouch at his belt and drew out something that glinted in the firelight. It was a small, smooth stone, dark blue with flecks of silver, like a fragment of the night sky itself. He pressed it into her palm. "For the journey," he said. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, warm contact that sent a shiver through her. Ilara closed her hand around the stone. It was cool, solid, a tangible piece of his steadfastness, his silent strength. "I have no words to thank you, Cale," she whispered, her eyes stinging. A faint smile touched his lips. "Words are wind. Your flight is your thanks." The next morning, he was gone. He left no trace, no sign of his departure, save for the lingering scent of wood smoke and pine, and the profound emptiness his absence created. Ilara stood by the stream, the hawk carving in one hand, the starstone in the other. She was alone, but not bereft. She was equipped, not just with skills, but with an unshakable sense of her own worth, her own resilience. She looked towards the distant mountains, then towards the uncharted lands that stretched before her. Cale was right. She had her own sky to find. The fear was a distant memory, replaced by a quiet determination, a sense of profound peace. She was Ilara. And she was free. She turned, not back towards redemption, but away from it, towards a future she would carve with her own hands, under her own sky. The path was unknown, but she walked it with a steady, confident stride, the silence of the wilderness no longer a threat, but a welcoming embrace. Years passed. The tale of the woman publicly whipped in redemption for refusing a powerful man, and the silent Modoc warrior who spirited her away, became a whispered legend in the scattered settlements and lonely homesteads of the frontier. Some said she had perished in the wilderness, others that the warrior had taken her to his tribe and made her his own. Few knew the truth. Jedediah Croft's power in redemption slowly waned. The story of his humiliation, though rarely spoken aloud in his presence, chipped away at his authority. The fear he had once inspired began to curdle into quiet contempt. The town itself seemed to carry a shadow, a memory of injustice that lingered in the dusty streets. Ilara did not vanish. She found her sky not in isolation, but in creating a small, hidden sanctuary in a fertile valley nestled deep within the protective embrace of the foothills, far from the reach of redemption's narrow laws. It was a place of peace, of quiet industry. She cultivated a garden, hunted with the skills Kale had taught her, her movements economical and sure. The hawk carving rested on her mantle, a constant reminder of her journey to strength. The starstone she wore on a leather thong around her neck, a touchstone of courage. She was not entirely alone. Over time, others found their way to her valley, women mostly, escaping harsh lives, seeking refuge, drawn by the whispers of a free woman who lived by her own rules. Ilara offered them sanctuary, not as a leader, but as an equal. She taught them what Kale had taught her, to survive, to be self-sufficient, to find their own strength. She spoke little of her past, but the scars on her back, sometimes visible when she worked in the summer heat, told their own silent story of endurance and defiance. They called her, simply, Ilara of the Valley. Her presence was a quiet inspiration. She judged no one, demanded nothing, merely offered the space and the knowledge for them to heal and grow, much as Kale had done for her. She never saw Kale again. But sometimes, when the wind blew from the direction of the high mountains, she would feel his presence, a steadfastness that transcended distance and time. She knew he was out there, a silent guardian of the wild places, a man who understood the language of the earth and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Her own spirit, once nearly extinguished, now burned with a steady, unwavering light. She had faced the darkness and emerged not unscathed, but whole, transformed. The name Ilara, once a source of shame, now embodied its true meaning, a star, guiding others through their own darkness. She had become a quiet legend, not of vengeance, but of resilience. Her legacy was not in grand deeds recorded in town ledgers, but in the changed lives of those who found solace in her valley, in the seeds of hope she planted in the fertile soil of human hearts. And as the sun set over her peaceful valley, casting long shadows from the surrounding peaks, Ilara would often look up at the first emerging stars, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. She had found her sky, and in it, she shone. The silence that surrounded her now was the silence of contentment, of a life reclaimed, of a spirit unbound. It was the most eloquent language of all.